of intros. Oh, apart from there's the recording on its way. So without more ado, let's crack on and see what we can say. So here is our set list for this morning. You'll be relieved to hear I'm doing the left-hand side of this page, not sort of a cappella versions of the right-hand side. But essentially, we are going to be sort of four major areas, looking at local area and population from various sources, looking at audiences in the local area, and then a bit of a discussion session sort of to share your views as well, get some reflections on that, and then a bit of a sort of feedback summary and where we go from here. I should say that we will be using data from Audience Finder, but for those of you who are Audience Finder organizations, we're not sharing anything that's specific to individual organizations. So don't worry, all of your secrets are safe with us, but we will be using that as one of the sources. So indeed, about the sources, we'll do a bit of a rundown of these. But by way of intro, one of my little cultural interests is the novelist James Joyce, and in one of his early books, he talks about the main character at school doing that thing that I think we've all done at some point in our notebook, where you kind of write down your address, but when you get to the bottom, you just keep going. So you've got the kind of, this is him and his class and his school, and then you get to the county, Ireland, Europe, the world, the universe. Just keep working out now. And then he sort of reverses it, comes back in, and kind of tries to place himself in this big framework of all these places. And that's essentially what I'm trying to do with this session. So we've got lots of different types of data, each of which is kind of arranged at different levels, so it sort of fits different geographies, and we'll be trying to kind of collage those together to get lots of different viewpoints that kind of hopefully tell a nice coherent picture. Just to run through what some of those sources are. Some of you will be familiar with some of these, maybe not all of them, but it's kind of easier to explain them at the outset before we dive into everything. So during COVID, as part of an academically funded project with the Centre for Cultural Value, we've been running population level surveys for in 5 different waves, looking at what the public are thinking, feeling, doing in terms of cultural engagement. So that's what they did before, what they're doing during COVID, and what they're thinking about doing in the future, but also looking at online, in-person attendance, creative engagement, as well as a whole range of other things. So things about attitudes, things about vaccination, things about how they feel about COVID, all sorts of things. So that's the Cultural Participation Monitor. The last wave of that was a sample of about 6,000 people. And all of these samples are weighted to represent the UK population overall. And because that last wave was such a big sample, we've got a big enough sample within the East Midlands of 400 odd to be able to talk about this at a regional level as well. So we can kind of look at the national picture, we can look at the regional picture. And we'll go into that in a bit more detail in a bit. Audience spectrum is our segmentation model for understanding the UK population, which essentially allocates every household based on the types of things that people tend to do in what combination. So groups that tend to do a lot of arts and cultural engagement and tend to do the same types of things are kind of clumped together. Ones that do sort of middling amounts are clumped together. Ones that do less are clumped together. And we've got that linked to every household, and therefore we can both profile real data, which we'll show with some of the profiling later, which again, many of you will be familiar with Audience Finder. But also we can look at what the lie of the land is on that. So then moving on, I've mentioned Audience Finder so far. Many of you, I think, are Audience Finder participants, but for those that aren't, it's a service that basically collates different audience information, either through surveys or through ticketing data, right across the country, lots of different art forms, all into a big aggregate, so we can then share findings individually, but also then sort of analyze it as an overall picture. So we'll be using that, both of those two sorts of it, and then we'll be using a load of population data as well. And that population data comes from things like the census or something called target group index, which you see in the initials there, but we gather them together in these things called area profile reports. So that's kind of a shorthand to say loads of stuff about the general population, age, occupation, all that kind of thing. The lowest geography we've got is looking at ward level, but that's mainly for the mapping. But it means we can, if we identify things that are interesting in the course of the conversation, zoom in and see actually what's going on at a really granular level as well. And breathe. How's everyone doing? Is that all right for an intro? Great. So, if that's what we're talking about, what are we actually going to say? So there's one other caveat I should raise on this, which is we have this slightly, one might almost say a sort of appropriately kind of fox head shaped map that we're using. So we've got, essentially, we'll be looking at for the audience finder data, we'll be looking at this blue shaded area, not the outline. So the blue area, which is essentially Derby, Derbyshire, Nottingham, Nottinghamshire, Leicester, Leicestershire, and Rutland. So that's our kind of defined. So when we talk about local, generally that's what we mean. We trimmed off those little top ears up near Sheffield, just because the geography of those just plays very differently, because lots of them are closer to Manchester, Sheffield, Stoke than Derby or Nottingham or else. And so we wanted, as if we can, to try and tell a coherent story by kind of pulling up a coherent geography. That's the plan. We will also talk about the East Midlands in general, but hopefully that distinction will be clear. Okay, so this will let me move on. So I've mentioned audience spectrum. We have our high engaged segments, metroculturals, of whom there aren't very many in this local area, so less concerned about them. Commuter land culture buffs, really key local audience, tends to be quite highly engaged, quite a little bit older, like more traditional, tending to live in the commuter belt, that kind of thing. Experience seekers, who tends to be more likely to be university graduates, live on the edges of cities, be younger on average, attend a wider range of activities, particularly more contemporary art forms. Then we have our mid-engaged people, who two of these groups are really big in this region, dormitory dependables and trips and treats. Both of those are relatively more likely to have families, although broadly speaking, they tend to be older and younger, respectively, those two groups. And they live, in slightly different areas, as we'll see in a sec. But we've also then got home and heritage as a kind of mid-engaged group, which tends to be what you might regard as your kind of stereotypical National Trust member type thing. So it's a little bit older, more of a heritage interest, moderately culturally engaged, but lots of other things they're interested in as well. Maybe a bit more of a skew towards some sort of participatory practical craft engagement as well. And then finally, we have our set of lesser engaged segments, particularly for this area, Up Our Street and Facebook Families being two really key groups. Both tend to be in more built up areas. Up Our Street tends, there's a bit of a preponderance of kind of the kind of settled communities in terrace streets that are a really big feature of Midlands and particularly actually northern cities. Facebook Families, there's a skew towards they tend to be younger, quite digitally engaged, hence the name, albeit Facebook's maybe changed its positioning since we named this, but nonetheless, tend to be lower income, more inclined to engage with arts and cultural activities where there's less of a price barrier, where it's more local, that kind of thing. And then finally, we've got a couple of other groups that are less prominent here, with some exceptions. So Kaleidoscope Creativity, who tends to be more of an urban group, but relatively lower engaged, and Heydays, who tends to be older, and often in sort of sheltered housing and that kind of sort of community housing. There aren't many of those, except that there's a couple of pockets near Chesterfield that we'll see.
Ollie, just to mention, we've had a question in from Nick from the Brilliant Mighty Creatives. Thanks for joining us, Nick. Just to say, you mentioned that you've trimmed the ears off the East Midlands. Do you want to, because we've had the question, Lincoln, Lincolnshire, Northampton missing. Do you want to just recap on why that is? But we are covering the East Midlands as well as a whole.
Yes, sorry,
Yeah.
yes. When I said we trimmed the ears, what I meant to, we trimmed the ears off Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire. We trimmed way more than the ears off East Midlands as a whole, I'm afraid. So what we're trying to do is just find a relatively smaller geography that kind of worked as a sort of coherent single block. So we know that the profile starts to change as you get out towards the East Coast. You also get slightly different interrelation between places. So, I suspect, with luck anyway, we'll get to do more focused things on different areas. But this was trying to look particularly at the kind of the three cities and what goes on around them. And that's partly because this bit of the East Midlands is a really interesting dynamic, I think, because you've got some really substantially sized centres uninterrupted by things like coastline or London. So you get a real sort of sense of that's what the relationship between these cities are and what the kind of push and pull are, which includes looking at what between the three cities, what are the break points, where do people tend to go in one direction or the other. So that was the kind of our zoom in there. So it isn't to neglect the rest of the region, just that we wanted to find a kind of coherent sized bit. I mean, in theory, we would, in some of our other sessions, we're going to places that are actually even a bit smaller. So I think the last one was Cumbria, which obviously in terms of populations is much smaller than this, but that's the logic. Hopefully that makes sense. Yes, so we're not trying to encapsulate the whole of the East Midlands, but it's an East Midlands focus. So hopefully that doesn't mean we're going to have loads of people from Lincolnshire who are just going to be upset and wanting to leave, because hopefully there'll be stuff here for you anyway. So in terms of audience spectrum and where it's come from, as I said, it's come from national survey data in terms of engagement. It's linked to various other things like how far people are from different types of culture, and other data sets that bring in all sorts of other information with them, and population data. But we can also now test it against what people have actually done in practice in terms of audience finder data. We're in the process of also looking at revisiting the segmentation to kind of drill down and to see whether we can differentiate some of these segments as well. So each one has its own little portrait, which might be helpful for those of you, particularly who are less familiar with them, just to explore, things like exactly who they are in terms of demographics, location, which we'll talk about, what they're interested in, how to communicate with them, what messages they respond to, what else they do. Okay. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. So this is the bit where I tell you what I can see in the data about the local population, and you can tell me whether that matches what you're used to. So here's our map. So we're going to look at some general demographic things, audience spectrum, and then some stuff in the cultural participation monitor that's about the whole population. We'll then come back to the monitor in terms of actual engagement stuff later. Okay, I have tried to avoid calling this bit East Midlands, but yeah, if I lapse, then there is that ambiguity. So, in terms of overall population, relative to the whole of the East Midlands, of course, because we've zoomed in around the cities, it tends to be more diverse as an audience, and relatively sort of in line with the UK population as a whole. 42% of households are families of various ages, which feels like quite a lot, but actually lines up with the average for England. In many ways, on aggregate, the East Midlands, well, at least this slice of the East Midlands, looks quite a lot like the overall national population. It's quite representative as an overall picture. We do have quite a lot of these groups I pulled out as we were talking through audience spectrum. So particularly some of these mid-engaged family groups or low-engaged family groups, and less of the outliers. So whereas in some places, if you start to zoom in on the audience spectrum profile, the story very quickly gets dominated by one or two really quite exceptional groups or that are really heavily concentrated in one place. Here, it's much nearer the general population, and as a result, kind of the really big groups really stand out. That has challenges and it has opportunities. So you don't have, in the way that some areas do, really high concentrations of groups that are just really easy wins in terms of cultural engagement. On the other hand, you don't have the flip side of that. So, okay. And in terms of cultural taste, yes, the big broad categories that people are generally interested across population sing through here as well. Okay. Some of this next bit, I will move through fairly briskly because the slides will be shared and available later, so I don't want to kind of dwell on that too heavily. Of the core city, of the three core cities in the area, Derby is less diverse, but by no means not at all, and a little bit more skewed towards professional occupations, but it's not a huge difference, but slightly higher engagement levels, but only a little bit. Once we get to Derbyshire, of course, you're out in some more rural areas, but relatively, quite high employment levels and the like of that. But as I think I've chatted with Anne about many times in the past, some challenges in terms of lower engagement. Okay. Nottingham, pretty worth putting out, particularly high number of families, and of course, quite a varied population within the city. And here we do have a big chunk of these experience seekers. So that's sort of relatively highly engaged, but still price is potentially a barrier. So worth noting them, and relatively high arts engagement. Okay. And then Nottinghamshire, similar kind of picture, really to what we're saying in Derbyshire, but the engagement just a little on the higher side, and a little bit more skewed towards some of these more traditional art forms. It's probably no surprise that in that list of places is one that's famous for having a Tory MP for decades in Ken Clark. So then Leicester itself, it's relatively diverse. Obviously, 51% white. This is over 16s, so of course the whole population, it's majority minority. Took me a moment to check why that figure wasn't coming out the way I expected. Lots of students, of course, given the is it just the two universities, 2, 3? Lots of experience seekers, which often comes with having a university locally, but equally, some of these more sort of lower income family groups, and sort of, the close group creativity, often lots of people living in flats and the like, but relatively lower engagement. And one of the things that we will sort of loop back to is that I think it's not a coincidence that the city that has the most diverse population has slightly lower engagement, because across the whole of this area, there is underrepresentation of diverse communities in the audience, which is by no means an issue unique to here, but worth noting. Okay, and then Leicestershire, again, a sort of similar picture, except that it's more of sort of student spillover, maybe, than we've seen in other ones, and of course these little pockets with higher engagement. And finally Rutland, which I admit, as a place, I know not at all. So it's one of the few counties I think I may never have been to. So apologies if you're a Rutlander, but relatively high attendance. And here we do have a decent chunk of community land culture buffs. So that's your kind of, if you like, your good fishing ground if you're a nearby large theatre. Says, I see Claire nodding. So yes, there we are. So just by way of illustration, we can see that. So here we just sort of paired up, or whatever the version for 3 of a pair is, trioed up some comparators. So we can see that there's a little bit more of a skew towards children in the household in Leicester and Nottingham compared to Derby, and they tend to be younger where they are there. That's the bottom left. Big swings in terms of ethnicity, obviously, but notably all of those 3 cities more diverse than national average. The city is making up quite a big chunk of the overall population, as you can see, and in terms of the age profile, although Derby and Leicester are pretty much similar as you would expect, nonetheless, there's slightly lower when it comes to late teens, early 20s. So I guess that's the impact partly of having colleges and universities that are larger more often. So that's part of what's going on there. In terms of occupation, I was expecting to see sharper difference in terms of occupational categories, but there is still a bit of a difference going on. So if we look on the right hand side, we've got a little bit more in terms of managerial professions in Derby. We've got slightly fewer professions in Leicester, but it's relatively marginal swings. Where we do see a bit of a difference, although it's currently hidden by your pictures, is where we look at the more process plant and machine operatives. Again, more substantially higher in Leicester, and Derby having substantially fewer people in elementary occupations. But broadly speaking, they're quite comparable, really, as places, which I think makes some of the other comparisons later more telling. When it comes to what people are actually doing with their time, though, it's worth noting that Derby has very many more people who are retired relative to students. So between them, they still make up a similar proportion of the population, but there is a bit of a tilt there. And then once, obviously, you get out into the counties, the student population is much lower, but as I mentioned, nonetheless rather higher in Leicestershire than elsewhere, and indeed relatively high in Rutland, which is interesting. Okay, so that's just a brief overall tour before we get to the audience spectrum profile, and we can see, or we could, if it wasn't covered by a transcript sign, that we've got 1 in 3 of the population are coming from these two mid-engaged, often quite family-driven groups. And one of the things that's curious about the population of this particular subset of East Midlands we're looking at is that all of the segments pretty much that it's highest for are underrepresented compared to East Midlands as a whole, but they're still higher than everything else. So it's almost like a sort of a less extreme version of that wider picture. So lots of dormitory dependables, lots of trips and treats, lots of groups who are potentially attracted by quite sort of eye-catching, broad offers that maybe hook into things that are familiar or have other, that aren't just about very intense cultural capital around very particular art forms that maybe relate to things that people have wider interest in. Often, particularly dormitory dependables, there is budget there. People will spend for things, but it has to be something that they have a sort of confidence it's going to be good and worth travelling to. And these groups do travel a bit. But then on the flip side, if we look further down, we do have quite a core of these sort of higher end of the lower engaged segments, if you like, concentrated in the urban areas, with again the Facebook families, lots of lower income families, but also quite settled communities near our streets.
We've just had a question. Can you just confirm what year the data's from, please?
So this is, off the top of my head, I can't remember for this. Where we're analysing transaction and survey data, those are all for the transactional data, it's 4 years before COVID, and for the survey data, it's the 3 years before COVID. So 17, 18, 18, 19, 19, 20, or that plus 16, 17. For this, it's based off the last census and then subsequent updates to that. But I think it's 2019 data, but I couldn't be absolutely certain without going back and checking. So this rather vibrantly coloured map is for each ward across the area. We've looked at which segment is present in higher quantities than any other. So this is giving you, if you like, a quick pen portrait of, broadly speaking, who's living where. Of course, it's worth saying that although it could be the largest single segment, there could be, big chunks of other groups that aren't visible here, but it gives you a bit of a flavour of the lie of the land. And one thing that jumps out is that you've very clearly in the north got big pockets around the coalfield area, which is several of these lower engaged segments. So, Facebook families, up our street, and then trip and treats, where you get slightly further out from some of the centres. Then you've got some of these quite big rural pockets with community land culture buffs, but it's sort of pushing out towards the peak, and then pushing it sort of down towards the southeast. And again, if we'd included more of the Peak District, we'd be getting more of that and more of the home and heritage you also see in these kind of pockets up in the north. Then when you get to the city centres, and you can see two of them here on the next slide, you then start to see the concentration of experience seekers. They're really kind of packed in around the city centres, but skewing to particular areas. So skewing west of Nottingham, for example, west of Derby, and indeed south and west of Leicester. Okay. For anyone that knows these areas really closely, is there anything that stands out to you about what you're seeing?
Obviously, talking from a Leicester point of view, it all looks pretty kind of what we expected to see. There's nothing surprising from a Leicester point of view. Can't talk for other areas.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say also from a Leicester point of view, it's the economic demographic, isn't it?
Right. So yeah. So I guess although it wasn't initially split on that, of course, it does tend to overlay with demographics quite clearly. So I'm guessing that the east end of Leicester is less affluent bit. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
One of those curious things, actually, lots of cities have that same shape because of prevailing winds and the historical industry. They tend to want to be upwind, so they tend to queue in the southwest in terms of housing.
That's interesting. So Derbyshire the same. I think it's not. Yeah, sort of trips and treats strip across the middle is quite interesting.
It is, isn't it? And a lot of that's kind of following the M1. So you've got that sort of big area, sort of in and around the M1, which I think is kind of possibly notable. So yeah, so you can see, some substantial differences, but equally some quite big pockets. Bornice is really, there are big clumps of community land culture buffs accessible from everywhere, albeit not evenly. Okay, we might come back to this map having looked at what the catchments are for the different cities. Anyhow, so moving on to the cultural participation monitor. So we've asked people a whole range of things about who they are, what they do, etc. But we asked people some broad questions about their attitudes to COVID and what impact that had on their behaviour and what they expected to do in future. Now, starting bottom left, the big story that we've seen this year, and this is right across the country, is that people's attitudes have been surprisingly slow to change. So we've asked the same question in February, in June, in September, October, and then in late October, early November. And that's where this data is from, late October, early November. In fact, up to 2 days before the latest variant was announced. So this doesn't include the impact that might have had on people's thinking. But right throughout that period, we were essentially seeing a third of people saying, if I saw an event that I was interested in, yes, I'd be happy to go. I don't need further persuasion or whatever else, or it's not conditional, I'm just happy to go. About a third of people saying, yes, I'll think about it, but maybe. And then variously, in different ways, about 40% of the population saying, not really now. And that could vary from, yes, I want it, reductions in risk, I want the whole thing to go away, or I'm just not interested, I kind of shut off a bit. And we did see a bit more as time went on, more people saying, actually, it's not really about the risk. I've just, it's out of my mind. I'm not interested. That was the only major shift we'd seen right the way through that period. It was staying really constant. That it basically a large third were saying, yeah, maybe not. It finally started to move just before the new variant turned up, which is somewhat bad timing. But finally, it bumped up to a full third of people saying they're happy to attend. Gone up about 3 or 4%. But when we look at this region in particular, it's just a little bit softer. So just slightly fewer people saying they're happy to attend. These aren't, it's a sample of 400 odd, so it's good, but it's not huge. So I wouldn't overread into these numbers, but it just implies that there's just a little bit more hesitancy, which you would expect, because some regions like London, people are much more, yeah, let's go, let's just, they're not so worried. So that's probably what's happening, really, is that London's pulling the overall average up, and this region is pretty much in line with the rest of the country otherwise. However, we also asked people about their general attitudes to COVID. And this is something we asked the first time this year, this last wave, so we haven't tracked it all the way through, but we wanted to know to what extent people were kind of hardline in either direction, in terms of do everything you can to suppress it, or don't do anything, just ignore it, carry on with life, or somewhere in the middle and you want to mitigate it a bit. And I guess there's 2 notable things that stand out for me here. One is that most people want to do as much as possible to reduce it. So that's really a big chunk of the population. Although we haven't asked this exact question before, we have been asking other attitudinal questions which very much give the same impression all the way through the pandemic. There is quite a strong desire for people to try and reduce it. In this region, there's a little bit more of that middle ground. So a bit more of people saying, actually, it's a thing, we have to find a way around it, or to work with it, or whatever, which might be the influence of having had more intense lockdown measures in the region as a possibility. So it could be people who said, actually, no, we really had enough now. But people aren't saying, as a rule, that they think that the measures taken are too extreme. So they're not saying that they don't like the measures. They're just saying, actually, you've just got to find a way of negotiating them. What strikes me as more curious, though, is that there does seem to be a bit of a blend going on between thinking it's something that, we're just going to have to deal with, that we think is going to blow over. If you look bottom right, quite substantially fewer people in this area, and this is the whole of the East Midlands, by the way. All of this modest stuff, when we say East Midlands, we do mean the whole of the East Midlands. Substantially fewer saying they think it's going to be around to be very likely to be an issue in 6 months, in a year, and so forth. Now, the exact numbers on this will obviously have changed given the new variant. So in a way, it's the difference which I think is the most interesting thing. So relatively speaking, people in this region are inclined to think that it's less likely to be an issue in the longer term. But they are more worried about catching COVID, or other people catching COVID, in the short term, but not more worried about themselves. So there's a slightly strange kind of balance of things going on, which feels like there's a certain amount of kind of, I don't know, I sort of wonder if it's almost like a savvy pragmatism, kind of like, well, we've really been in amongst it, we've seen what's going on, we've had to deal with lots of stuff, but you just get on with life, you've got to deal with it. It's a sort of flavour I'm sort of getting, but I don't know whether, does that square with kind of the impression that any of you are getting in terms of attitudes in the region? Yeah, a few people nodding. So yeah, I mean, it is certainly interesting when you see how some of these differ. The response here is probably a bit more similar to Scotland and Wales, which again would maybe reinforce the idea that maybe the additional lockdown measures is kind of coming out in other attitudinal statements.
It may also be, in Derbyshire anyway, to do with the age of the population. That I mean, our experience is that people are still very wary of going out to events. So
yes, age is certainly the thing that we've seen as most most striking difference, across all sorts of different behaviours and attitudes and things right the way through has been age. And it really does seem, understandably, because people's experience, certainly in the early parts of the pandemic where no one was vaccinated, the health outcomes were much worse than one group than another, the economic impact was much worse for younger groups. You do get a bit of a, difference there.
We also have a separate question. It might feed into something that you're about to cover. But Kimberly's asked, is there anywhere that unpicks the transport network and the influence on audiences? So you've mentioned the M1 already. Maybe this, feeds into audience data and activity.
Yes. So not at huge length, but we do come back to the M1 later, because I had a theory that the M1 was going to be crucial, and that's partly based on previous conversations with Anne and others. I won't spoiler whether that turns out to be the case, but yes, keep your eyes on the M1. Yes, good point. Was there any others that I've not answered as yet?
No, at the moment you're all good. Thank you.
And yes, we are sharing this afterwards, just in case we've answered that. So, if that's the ground picture in terms of the population, it's a starting point. Then let's look at some audiences and what audiences are doing and thinking. So this is what we're looking at in terms of data. So I'm going to have to explain this little map and diagram on the right hand side, because it seems really convoluted, but it's really not, as long as I explain it right. But when we talk about local audiences, we could be talking about one of three different groups of people. We could be talking about people who are from within this area, attending within this area. So that's group A. We could be talking about people from within this area, but who are going elsewhere. That's group B. And we could be talking about people from elsewhere who are attending in this area. Yeah. So at various points, I'll highlight different ones of these. It's worth noting that group A are by far the largest. So by and large, they will be affecting the overall profiles more than anything else. As you can see, we've got a whole load of different venues in the mix. We're not putting out anyone individually, but that should be enough to give us quite a broad picture across the piece. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any huge omissions in that data set, but I could be wrong. But yes, we need to be aware that anything based on audience data is based on this particular set. So that may be a factor when we talk about things later. We've also got population monitor, as mentioned, 400 odd surveys across the whole of the East Midlands, not just this bit of it. So without drawing too broad conclusions from a small data set, it is at least, nationally representative, a representative sample pulled from across the region. Okay. So broadly speaking, in terms of the ticketing data, and I will be talking more from the ticketing data than survey data, partly because it avoids some of the issues about who's collecting more surveys than who, and therefore what the relative weight of the different organisations is, because organisations that sell more tickets have more transactions. That's just a nice, neat lineup. And so we'll skew towards ticketing data. But what we've seen, broadly speaking, is across the 4-year period, a bit of a growth across the board. So more bookers, more bookings, more tickets, more income. So that's all good. It means all of you who are marketers can congratulate yourselves. But in terms of rough scale, we're talking about 250,000 bookers. And bearing in mind, we're talking about population within this boundary of about 3.1 million. So it's about 1 in 6 people. So it's a lot, but could potentially be headroom there when you think that maybe 1 in 3 people are engaging in various popular art forms within any 12-month period. What we can do, though, is take all those different individual figures and see how they've changed based on the year we started with. So if for all of them, if we fix that first year as 100, then we can see, well, relatively speaking, has it gone down or up? You know, is it above 100, below 100? And the thing that stands out here is that income is the thing that's really risen. So the others have crept up, but income has risen more substantially. That will partly be inflation, because we're talking about a full year period. So that will have accounted for a bunch of that. But it does seem to imply that it's similar kind of levels of actual bookers, albeit with some churn, of course. Similar-ish levels, well, very similar levels of tickets. It's just that people are spending a little bit more on average for them. Of course, if that trend pushes onwards too far, you will then potentially see a contraction of the audience and a kind of narrowing of the type of people engaging. But it's not a hugely pronounced trend here, given inflation. It is, you know, it's 11% increase rather than the others are quite marginal variations. Now here, if we look at sales by art form, we need to be a little bit careful about the fourth year of this, because 2019-20 was, of course, the end of that financial year was the beginning of COVID. And as a result, lots of organizations were somewhat distracted from doing their art form coding, which, you know, is very easy to understand. So we need to be a little bit careful about that year. But across the board, you can see that most art forms are kind of going along fairly steadily. Interestingly, plays drama seems to be doing all right in this region, although we've seen nationally that some dips elsewhere. So if you just look at those first 3 years, because again, caveats about the fourth one.
Ellie, sorry to interrupt, but just before you move on, Nick's asked, does this include touring productions who will have also been asked to fill out audience surveys?
So this is based off transaction data, so it's based on the venues in the region. When we talk about the survey data in a sec, it will be surveys filled out by anyone who lives in the region. So they could have filled out the survey in Exeter or Sheffield or wherever, but if they live in this area, they'd be counted. Okay.
Perfect, thank you.
So I'm just trying to rearrange the chat so I can see the questions as they come up. Okay, so if we take a different look at the art form picture, and again, this is the same method of saying if the original year was 100, have sales gone, of tickets gone up or down? You can see that with a few exceptions that have gone notably up, things like dance, interestingly. And I don't know if there's a particular driver for that, which anyone could share, if they've, I don't know, had dance seasons that have gone particularly well, maybe. But broadly speaking, lots of those art forms are actually holding pretty steady. Although Christmas show was looking like it was fading a bit, even pre-pandemic. Does that chime with anyone? Does that feel like a kind of a picture that any of you would recognize? I appreciate this is probably more. Sorry, go on.
I mean, obviously I'm talking about curves specifically, but 1920 was, we kind of went complete opposite direction, in particular for Christmas. And yeah.
Christmas was really strong, 1920.
Yeah, it was West Story, so yeah.
Yeah. So again, bearing in mind that the 1920 figures I've kind of grayed out because it was, you know, pandemic, or coding was then affected by the pandemic. But yeah, so but during the years previous to that, was the Christmas stuff holding up pretty well, the curve?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it wasn't kind of like a sudden burst from the blue. It's on constant. What about the dance thing? Has anyone had a let's see a reason why the dance seems to be doing pretty strongly?
I mean, the only thing kind of I can think that would kind of skew that would be kind of sold out shows for Matthew Bourne, which we had quite a few.
Yeah,
so that would be a lot of data. That would be a lot of data and a lot of ticketing and bookers that would be segmented into dance. And I would imagine that's probably true for the likes of Nottingham Theatre Royal and places like that as well, which could kind of, the percentage of data could skew.
So one of the two really big blockbusters are doing the work there. Yeah, that could be true. And yes, Sian, as you say, that it's dance, contemporary dance, you know, that kind of big name dance as well. Yes, there we are. Obviously, Christmas shows is an interesting one because if it was dipping a bit before overall, then obviously there's been quite a difficult time at Christmas for the time being. So, so there's a comment there, which is really interesting. Ballet is really commercial. Yes, fair point. But it's notable that it's risen as opposed to fallen. Yes, there. Because I think contemporary dance nationally hasn't been having such a great few years. Anyway, Strictly, yes, that is indeed the other piece of the jigsaw. So, fab, thanks. So, okay. So in terms of the local audience data, then, obviously large amounts of ticketing data, heavily skewed towards locals studying locally, as you would expect. Most people for most things aren't traveling too far. This does exclude zero value tickets. Actually, yes, Patty. Substantial numbers of surveys, similar picture. There's maybe more of a contrast in the ticketing data, so less of a sense that people are being pulled in than on the survey data. You maybe expect that because the sorts of things people maybe go to if they're traveling for leisure or trips away, etc. People are maybe on average more likely to go to museums and galleries. That's an extra thing rather than theatre. So that's probably why that's happening. But notable that the area is a net importer of bookers and attenders, which is obviously, well, logically it can't be the case everywhere, but it's certainly not the case to get further south. Areas tend to be kind of net exporters, attenders. So here we have then the audience spectrum profile of those three different slices for ticketing data, and then we'll look at survey data in a second. And you can see that broadly speaking, if you just sort of stand back a little, it's got a similar shape to the overall population of the local area. So big dominance of those two mid-engaged groups, although then the two of the left-hand blue groups are a bit lower relative to population, but you'd expect them to be because they're defined by the fact that they tend to engage less on average. And notably, community land culture buffs kind of surge out in terms of relative importance. But that's particularly true when we start to think about people who are traveling, either traveling in or traveling out. It's the same difference, and also applies to Stormshire dependables, that these two groups are much more mobile as audiences than some of the other groups. So you're more likely to be able to get them from further away depending on what you're putting on. And obviously, given that between them they're making up, getting on for 40, 45% of audiences, that's probably something to be really conscious of. Of course, metroculturals, there aren't many in the region, so you have a higher proportion of people travelling in. And those will probably be travelling in largely from London, or maybe some from the likes of Birmingham. But... Okay. Have you tried separating free versus paid? Would it show similar picture of segmentation? We at different points have done profiles of free versus paid, and yes, there is a difference. It's not a complete flip in terms of, you don't get a complete compensation, but it certainly does move back towards being a bit more balanced. So that would probably be true here. But free tickets aren't a huge proportion of the data in here anyway. Do you know how diversity and protected characteristics overlap this data? Yes, some of the segments have relatively higher proportions of particular protected characteristics. So, for example, there's higher proportions of disability amongst heydays, but also up our street. There are higher concentrations of minority ethnicities of various sorts in kaleidoscope creativity and experience seekers to some extent, but also actually up our street to some extent as well. But it's only a sort of a tendency towards one or the other. So in a way, it's sort of better to go direct to data around those particular particular characteristics, whichever one you're interested in. A way of doing that is using the kind of more granular data about particular locations people are from, because although it'll be an approximation, it's a more specific approximation than the overall profiles. If that answers that question. Where are we? It's a bit of work around our Group A. Culture Education Partnership in Nottinghamshire currently have a funding bid around culture on your doorstep. There's a bit of a problem in that area. Yes, I think that is a challenge. I think it's also, if you're going to engage a really broad range of the population, it's the doorstep audiences where you're going to achieve it probably, because we're not seeing people travelling as far in these other groups. So that's definitely, yes, if that's what you're looking to achieve, that definitely would be the focus and the priority. Family programming as well is likely to be quite a big, both opportunity, but also in terms of the overall profile of the audience here, but also in terms of which groups are likely to be most engaged by doing more or different things. That's likely to be quite a good way in. So the picture on survey data is broadly speaking the same. I mean, it's a little less extreme. So if we just toggle between them, you can see, we're getting up to sort of 27%, and it's only 20-ish% at the highest level. But the broad shape of it is it's flatter, but it's the same broad shape profile. So bearing in mind, I said there are caveats about the survey data because we can't wait between individual organisations. There are a lot of organisations in the mix here anyway, and so on average, it seems to be giving us a fairly consistent message. Okay. One thing to note, where we have largely tried to exclude the pandemic year figures just because they've just weirded everything, we have put them in here just to note that during the pandemic, the people who did engage skewed quite heavily towards the most highly engaged groups. So you see a really pronounced shift. So, whether it's relatively limited time windows, or maybe people maybe felt like they were spending a bit more of their risk budget by attending, it was the people who were, relatively speaking, more inclined to be existing engagers, or where culture was kind of like a more defining part of their life, were relatively speaking more likely to therefore want to engage in those circumstances, which I'm sure that you've experienced because everyone else I've spoken to has had the same thing over the last few months. Does this include attendance at digital events? This doesn't, or at least it only would if people were running digital events through their box office, which I guess, yes, some will have been, but not necessarily on a complete scale. We have looked in the participation monitor about engagement digitally and non. And in fact, actually, I'm going to come on to that, so I'll pick that up there. Sorry, I have to expand the chat to catch that comment. Just wanting to hear the work to engage the most vulnerable and the hardest to reach.
Yeah, it's just reflecting on the data that we would have all been doing stuff with our local food banks and to kind of see it in that way, just to perhaps see maybe that the inequalities of access to the arts have increased during the pandemic and not the other way around. Like all I've been doing for the last 2 years is stuff in our really hard to reach communities. So, but maybe it's that thing about where we're getting our data from for it.
Yeah, I think it's probably a mixture of that that stuff doesn't get to put through the box office. But even so, because obviously we've also been doing the population level, asking people directly, what have you been doing? And yes, it has got more unequal, but I guess, I mean, very unfortunately, but it's one of those things where, privilege is a privilege and it has all sorts of advantages that come with it. And people are under less pressure. Some people are actually financially better off as a result of the pandemic, but not if you started off worse off to start with. They've got worse. The health impacts, relatively speaking, are less severe, if you're more affluent, if you're professional occupations, etc. So there's loads of factors pushing in the same direction of people engaging more if they're starting from a privileged position.
It's quite a powerful.
Great that we've been doing the work.
It is quite a powerful statistic. Like, selfishly, just thinking for future funding bids and work around tackling inequalities, to know that here's some evidence that says things have gotten worse for people. I know what you're saying, that if people can't meet their basic of needs like feeding and clothing their children, the last thing they're going to be thinking about is, oh, let me go and engage with what's happening. So I do understand, but yeah, I think that's really shocking and kind of sad.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. It's so the big project that this all came out of, this population monitor with the University of Leeds, we're in the process of finalising the report for that, which will be out shortly, which should help with making those kind of cases, because this compounding of inequality is one of the really stark things that's come out.
But isn't there a kind of counter narrative that goes, actually, if you did take into account all the kind of food bank work and all the kind of social work and everything else that's been going on, actually that would produce a completely opposite story in a sense, wouldn't it? And actually maybe it is much, if the fundamental ways of measuring things is the box office, maybe that's telling us something about actually that's not enough any longer, and the COVID gave us an opportunity to engage in ways that bypass the box office, but so far haven't been captured really.
I think that's true in one way, and you're right that yes, box office can't be the be all and end all, but because the research we were doing as part of this participation monitor, we were literally going to the representative sample of the overall public and saying, what have you done, as opposed to saying what information we're capturing through organisations or venues. And we were seeing it at a public level, there is that disparity. So it's also, I guess, because some of that work in terms of engaging through food banks and community groups and things, it's hard work, it's more intensive work. You have to do more work for a given output. So you can work incredibly hard at something and make a real and important difference. But just in sheer numbers terms, a Matthew Bourne production turns up and a whole load of people who like that kind of thing and have money will turn up, and that proportionately is going to outweigh work.
It is, and I think that's certainly true with a lot of the work that we did in Derbyshire, are doing still in the pandemic, is engaging one-to-one, one artist to one person. That's incredibly expensive and time consuming, but enormously valuable for the people that we're engaging with, because they're we're doing stuff over the phone with people who can't leave their house or have extreme health problems and all of those kinds of things. It also made me wonder whether those harder to reach groups don't respond to these surveys. So actually, do we find out what they're doing?
What Oliver's saying is that you literally went there, though, didn't you? Did you include people standing with an iPad? And
so it's not people standing on the street, but when we surveyed people, we made sure we were collecting the proportionate numbers of surveys from different demographics.
From all the categories, so okay.
If we were hearing too much of certain groups, we stopped collecting surveys from them and started collecting more surveys from other groups. So yeah, it is tricky, but I suppose one of the things certainly the Centre for Cultural Value is hoping coming out of the research they've done, because they've looked at workforce and they've looked at impact on ecologies as well as the audience work and other things, is that hopefully reinforcing the message of the New Arts Council strategy, there is a recognition that actually this kind of work is hugely important and should be a higher proportion of the kind of activity that the sector's doing. Even if that isn't something which directly turns into very large numbers of footfall. Patty, is that pronounced right? Sorry.
I think maybe my comment is linked to this. So I'm working at Nottingham City of Literature, and I joined in July. All our events are free, so they're not ticketed. Well, some we get people to register, and we haven't really input any data to Audience Finder, and I'm not really sure how much literature organizations use Audience Finder. I used it before in other places I worked. So yeah, I'm a bit unsure how much it's going to kind of work for us for the type of events we do. But I'd be really keen to use it, obviously, and that's why I was asking about the free events. Yeah, just because I'm not really sure, and I don't know. I mean, I think in my mind, some of the performing arts audiences probably would be similar to literature in terms of segmentation. But again, I think, and for what I hear from other literature organizations, they don't really. Most of the events are free as well. So again, I don't know how, and if you know what the picture is for specifically for literature and if it's accurate, and that's why I was asking specifically for the free events.
I mean, certainly there are dozens of literature organisations that do use Audience Finder, albeit it skews towards some types rather than others. So lots of the literature festivals do, or some of the large festivals do. But yeah, as you say, maybe less for free events, etc., or certainly unticketed events. But I think one of the things that this has really brought home to us is the importance of that kind of collage of different data sources. So having stuff that's survey based, having stuff that's ticketing based, having stuff that's population survey based, having stuff that's you know, based on more qualitative, rich experience, all in the mix together, because any one of those methods can miss, you know, campus population and or aspects of people's experience. Which is raising a challenge for us, because the participation monitor was a particular funded project operating on the assumption that COVID would have been done by now. But we're increasingly looking at it thinking people seem to be really valuing the fact that we can look at the population, not just the data we're getting direct from existing audiences, but what does that, you know, how do we do that? Yes, so we are always interested to hear if you think that kind of thing is useful and useful to continue with. Do let us know, because that helps us kind of make the argument internally and externally that's the thing we would continue with.
Thank you.
Yes, well, there is a summary report about live literature on Audience Agency website, and just by the by, which have some information on there, but that's from I think 3 years ago. Okay, shall I carry on for a bit and then see how we're getting on? So this was just to say that very largely we're talking about local bookers rather than non-local bookers in the mix. And this is looking at relatively how the audience spectrum profile has changed over that 4-year period. And I've grayed out the middle bit to say, let's not get too carried away by tiny differences. But broadly speaking, it appears to be the case that some of those groups with higher concentrations of families appear to be rising up in terms of the mix. This is all, you know, obviously pre-pandemic. We know through the pandemic that families are pretty much the single group that's keenest to return and keenest to do more. So they're likely to be quite a useful group in the future as well. So that's kind of interesting if you're building on an existing trend. We're seeing some of the older groups had been tailing off proportionately already. And we go again, the same groups are more likely to be more resistant to coming back because of COVID. Sorry, that is me having not brought the title back in front of the chart when I changed the chart. It should say trends. Beg your pardon. So yes, it's a layering issue. So yes, so that appears to be the big shift. And actually proportionately, those higher engaged groups seem to be softening just slightly relative to sort of middle engaged groups. So in a way, that's just the drift is towards where your core population is, which could be useful. So for this next one, I just to be really careful how you want to put it about this. So these are looking just at the cities rather than shires, to answer the question, and looking at people who had answered surveys who lived in the cities regardless of where in the country they filled out the survey. So this is not saying this is attenders at organisations in these cities. So this isn't necessarily about you individually as organisations, compared to the population of the city. And I've zoomed in on the cities because obviously that's where you have highest concentration of diverse audiences or diverse population. And it struck me that it was very notably skewed towards the white population across the board. Despite the fact that I know that organisations in this region are probably doing, you know, as much or more than anyone in terms of being more inclusive in this kind of way. But it just struck me as notable, and maybe something which sort of flags that there is potentially, you know, more that could be done. Now we do need to be a bit careful because, again, you know, we can't be absolute in terms of the sampling, but it certainly seems to be the case that engagement is more skewed than we'd like. Does that match with people's experience? Or match with things that you're already looking at and working on? So, yeah. So, okay. So somebody's a call for action. Yeah. So, okay. So, and it probably ties into as well that conversation we just had about, you know, different types of work that's been done. About, yeah, we're just looking at the overall. Oh, spoilers! Oh, go away. So you will have seen a bit of a teaser on the next slide there. But what we did is we looked at, for each ward within our local area, whether more people from that ward attended venues. This is again just from the ticketing data. Attended venues in Derby, in Leicester, or in Nottingham. For each of those patches. And this is where I had assumed that the M1 was going to be a really nice, neat slice down the middle. And you'd have pretty much, you know, west of the M1 going towards Derby, east of the M1 going towards Nottingham, and then obviously anything that was nearer Leicester than the other two cities will end up going that way. Is that, broadly speaking, what you might have expected? Or is that just me? Lots of poker faces who are like, oh, they're not going to show their hand. Fair enough. So, with a caveat that there are more venues in Nottingham within this mix, but also potentially that there are more venues in Nottingham, this is what we saw. So as a broad picture, Nottingham was pushing quite a long way west, and indeed even somewhat to my surprise, quite a long way northwest. So you can see that kind of slightly darker line running up the middle is the M1. And Derby really is only getting majority of everything from the centre and westwards. So it's not kind of pushing back relative to Nottingham. And I was expecting there to be a nice, neat joining point somewhere right in the middle, and it sort of isn't. So again, this could be about the balance of venues. So I don't want to over-read into this, but it does seem to suggest that, broadly speaking, there is a coherent pattern. You know, it's not all speckled and mixed up. So there is quite a broad sort of watershed type pattern where beyond a certain line you go one way. But that watershed does appear to be a little bit further across than we might assume.
Is there a tiny little ward in Leicestershire that's going to Derby?
There does
or
appear,
is that,
yes.
Is that Rutland
Yes.
water?
No, I think that is an actual ward. Similarly, there's one down out towards Lichfield that
Yeah.
And of course that's partly about, you know, you take enough data and divide it small enough, there's going to be speckles and differences. But yes.
From a Derbyshire point of view, it'd be very interesting to see how the other big cities pull in Derbyshire too: Sheffield, Manchester, Birmingham.
Yes,
because we're right in the middle of huge conurbations, really,
and potentially threatened from all sides, so to speak.
yeah.
Yes, in fact, I think my colleague Elise is listening and will either be delighted or horrified by me going, oh yes, let's make another map. But
Delighted.
if we took all of the core cities and then said, okay, so what's the overall picture? That could be quite interesting, couldn't it? That can maybe be a post-Christmas treat. So Halifax have that problem, they're threatened by all sides. Yes, Halifax, Huddersfield, to some extent Wakefield have a sort of similar challenge. Although it would be admittedly places not quite on the same scale as Derby. But yes, so there is that kind of, what's the point where people are making a choice one way or the other, and what is it that drives that choice?
But some of those cities that you've mentioned there, well, and some smaller towns in Yorkshire as well, that some of the way that they perhaps, well, I don't know whether they consciously did this or not, but they kick back against that is by having very specialised events, festivals. Or I'm thinking of Huddersfield Contemporary Music Festival, for instance, which is
that would be.
It's not the sort of thing you would expect to happen in Huddersfield, but it does, and it's highly successful. So it's
yes. In fact, Buxton's another interesting one. That potentially where it's sat, it's competing with 5 cities, and yet it has a really quite distinctive offer and experience. It's not just about what's on, but kind of like the whole staging of it.
The whole, yes, it is true, and I mean it does draw massive audiences from Manchester, Sheffield, and London to come to the festival. So
so those kind of interesting examples. So I guess that's also because obviously there's lots going on in Derby thinking about City of Culture, and maybe this starts with feeding into thoughts about what's the distinctive offer that could have maybe draws from those other areas, as well as the kind of providing an offer that is an equivalent offer to what's happening elsewhere as well. But yes, there you are. I thought that was sort of an interesting question, at least to raise based on that. Although I love the idea of doing the bigger version of the map. So we did look just at the 3 cities and where their catchments were, just to check that it wasn't that one catchment was just heavily skewed over on top of the other. So you can see, the catchments are kind of what you'd expect in terms of scale, size and distance. You can see that broadly speaking, they sit within halfway to the next biggest place, but with more concentration, much more locally. So you'd expect that in Derby. Similar thing with Nottingham, except you do get these clumps further out. So maybe notable. There's maybe probably a less competition in terms of Nottingham, north and west to some extent.
I'm amazed how much comes from the northwest down to Nottingham. I'm amazed that Nottingham has such a pull right up into the northwest of Derbyshire. It's interesting, isn't it?
Yes. Yes, I think that way. Yes. Yes, it is quite notable. Particularly as because in a previous job I worked based in Sheffield, working on public transport data. And there are these sort of areas of the Peak District that are adjacent to Sheffield. People from there travel into Sheffield more often than people who live in Sheffield do, if that makes sense, into the centre of Sheffield. So there is really quite a strong.
For instance.
Sorry?
Like Hathersage or.
Yes.
And if you want to pass it that long,
So yes, so the fact that there's still a pull from Nottingham felt that far is interesting, I think. And potentially that's a sign that just people doing very good work there. But and then finally, Leicester. So I think we got the impression from the previous map that Leicester very much sort of dominates its own space much more clearly, and I think that's evident here. It's quite evenly spread, it's quite broad. A little bit less to the east, but actually not hugely. So
that also may be a function of Leicester, of the geography, that Leicester's right in the middle of Leicestershire, and Derby and Nottingham are not in the middle of their counties. So
yes,
and the transport links are different, therefore. The way that the roads work in Leicester is different to how they do in Derby and Nottingham.
that's interesting. Can you unpack that a bit, because that's quite.
Well, just that because Leicester's right in the middle of the county, the road network tends to all lead into.
You're heading in that way anyway. Yeah.
Into the middle of Leicester, yeah, which is not the same sort of pattern with the roads in Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire.
Yeah, it could be about. And I think maybe around Derby, there's some more dispersed concentrations of employment. Because it's where they attend, where they live and where they work. It could be that's kind of putting it a bit. I don't know.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So, shall I just head on to a little bit more about the CPM, but then we can move into a bit more discussion about what this all might mean, or how things are going, or you're hearing more from your viewpoints. So here we're looking at, so this is again looking at the overall population, what they're telling us, across the UK and specific to the East Midlands as a whole region about engagement during the pandemic. So this survey was done in November. It's any engagement since March 2020, unless it specifies otherwise. These more detailed bits down here. So any in-person engagement, it's a bit above average here. It's a bit above average. It was above average in 2020. It was still above average in 2021. The gap's closed, I guess, as the people have caught up in terms of overall engagement. But generally speaking, people are a little bit more inclined to engage. So that's kind of, or have been more inclined to engage. That's positive. It maybe ties in with some of the attitudinal things we saw, but not others. So that's kind of curious. The people maybe are telling us that they're less happy to engage, but actually in practice, it turns out they have. So, that's an interesting trade-off. But also engaging more online. So, there's more detail on the online stuff in a sec, but broadly speaking, there's a bit of a skew. Again, caveats about sample sizes, but it seems to be the case that we've had more online engagement. Of course, this isn't necessarily online engagement with organisations in region, although we know that people did tend to engage more with organisations they already attended, but it doesn't have to be. So it could be people watching the Met in New York or whatever. When we look in more detail, we can see that pretty much that overall picture of more engagement in person was true largely across the board, with the odd exception. And again, these differences, probably the margin of error is such that you probably shouldn't worry about them too much. But, broadly high across the board, in terms of different types of digital activity as well, as far as we can tell. Really, I'd be wary anything below a 3% difference to get too excited by, but it looks like there's a bit more going on. And we look at participatory activity. It's much more in line for many of the activities, but a bit higher for things like crafts and visual arts. So I don't know what to make about that in terms of whether there's a bit more of a visual arts appetite in region, but there aren't any huge differences. So, for example, in Cumbria, we saw a more notable difference from reading for pleasure, which is much higher. But, it's much more in line with the average, which fits with what we're saying about the overall population profile. Okay. Now, one of the things that we, and I'm sure you, have been very exercised by is what people think about different measures in terms of engagement. Broadly speaking, the local population is very much in line with the general public in terms of measures. They all think that most measures are important. So you give people an option of a safety measure, they want it, seems to be the general message. Of course, things like ventilation and masks, people do care about less outdoors, but even then, we're still talking clear majorities, thinking it's important for them to feel comfortable, which is notable, if perhaps slightly concerning. Things like hand sanitizer come out really important, despite the fact it's probably, scientifically not quite as important as things like ventilation. However, broadly speaking, the general population is satisfied with the measures they experience when they come into them, experience them. And that's particularly true here. So the thing that struck me was, a 5% difference of people saying they want more measures when they come back. There really is quite a solid, yes, what's there is fine, which maps back to having a higher proportion of people who are saying, you need to make accommodations, you have to be realistic about what you can do. So that does feel potentially like a kind of quite, reassuring message in terms of the local population views. We have seen through the monitoring in general that by and large, people are happy with the measures that venues are putting in place. We also asked people in more, to go into more detail, not just what measures would you want if you came back, but if you were to come back and the measures were the same as they were, would that stop you attending? And very few people said that they'd attended, seen the measures and were put off. So, the vast majority of people are saying, no, what we've seen is fine. Of course, this was all pre-Omicron variant, but since we've not seen big swings with other variants previously, I don't necessarily assume it would change hugely. Now, which I think might be the last one. One of the things we asked people is whether they expected to attend more in the future or less in the future across these 4 different broad categories of cultural events or cultural activities. I gave them a 5-point scale. To say 1 was yes, attending more often, 5 less often, and then you could be a bit in either direction. And we counted the bit in either direction sort of half as much when we were kind of weighting it. And it wouldn't change the overall shape of the output, whether we counted it half as much, 1/3 as much, 2/3 as much, whatever. And the general picture is most people are expecting to attend most things less often in the future. So not great news as a top level finding. That's not true in terms of outdoor activities. Given how long a majority of people expect COVID to keep having an impact on their attendance, with clear majorities saying it's going to be even a year, 2 years, we can probably expect that to persist, and that we probably will have ended up with at least a 4-year period of in-person attendances impacted by the pandemic. But it's higher for some things than others. So the more you're likely to be sitting down, is more people are more likely to attend less. But also there's something about the kind of the unique value of the experience. So film is coming out a little bit lower because you can after all watch film elsewhere. So we didn't ask people specific reasons. We just said, do you expect to attend more or less? And so that if you like, that's the summary picture of bad news. There are a few exceptions to this in terms of the youngest age groups expect to attend more across the board. Those in London expect to attend more as well. But very generally, it's a pretty consistent picture. But it is less extreme here than elsewhere. So I guess looking further ahead, there's maybe some relative better bad news, if you see what I mean. If that's the way of putting it. Okay. So does anyone have any sort of immediate thoughts or questions before we break out and just have a little bit of a sort of slightly smaller group discussion about what you've heard, what you think, how it relates to your experiences? Anything immediately people want to either clarify or? I'm also really conscious that there is a lot of data here and a lot of information here. You absolutely can get the slides to flick through. What we're going to do is afterwards, we're going to share them on the TAA community site. So you can access them all there, but also then there's various sort of chat and discussion functionality around it. So if you want to, you can then have further conversations about particular bits of it there as well. And we'll share details of that later on. So if there we are, we're interested to see the messaging and audiences and COVID measures. If people have any to share, that really would be interesting to discuss with that. So can I suggest, one of my colleagues is about to, I believe, randomly allocate you into groups, and I will let them use their judgment of how many groups that takes to get to groups of about 6. What would be great is if you could have a brief conversation, we'll say maybe 15 minutes or so, about any reflections of what you've seen, what I've shared. If you've got any views on any implications that it might throw up in terms of what that means, anything you're curious about that's come out, you sort of think, oh, I didn't think it'd be like that, or I wish I knew more about the implications of that bit. But also then linking it to your own experiences, and if you're happy to, I think it's really valuable if people can share, how things are going for them at the moment, what they've seen in terms of the really kind of up to the minute trends as well. So if you're happy to do that, we'll then reconvene. We'll call you back from the groups in about 15 minutes or so. I'll also pop into some of the groups just to say hello and give you a chance to ask any questions if you want them smaller. Am I sure you want to share how things are at the moment? Yes, with the caveat that we don't have any sort of trained therapists on hand. But yes, but equally, yes, at the agency, we're always happy to, chat to people about how things are going. So, do always feel we've got, there is a friendly ear there, but yes. Fab. So if that's all right, Lou, are you about to press the button on the groups?
I'm ready. So it should just come up asking everyone to join the group. If you just join the group, then that'd be great. And Ollie and I will stay in this main room if you have any questions.
Smashing. Lovely. We'll speak to you in a minute.